今日の講師はプロフェッサージム・スミスで、ご存知の方もいるかと思いますが、チェルノブイリ原発事故の環境、特に河川について実は世界的な権威でいらっしゃいます。でチェルノブイリに関する本ですね、1995年に出版されました。これ非常に良い本で、今日はその、3時間をかけていろいろ基礎から講義していただきますので、質問をぜひして、こういう機会をインターネット質問を通していただければありがたいと思います。
Okay.
Okay, so please.
Is the microphone working okay? Yeah, that's good. Okay.
Just a second. 動いてないよ。そうかそうか、そういう意味で。Okay, just for cat.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. Thank you for inviting me to give a lecture. It's a great pleasure to be here in Japan and to talk to you about some of my work. I'm going to speak just in English, and I'll try and speak slowly and clearly. But if I go too fast, or if there's something you don't understand, then just tell me and ask a question or whatever. Okay. Sometimes I get too enthusiastic and I go very fast. So I would like to tell you, I've been studying particularly the Chernobyl accident and effects of radioactivity in aquatic systems. I've been studying this since 1990, so for more than 25 years now. And in those 25 years I've learned some things, not very many things, but I would like to tell you what I've learned in that 25 years. And I'll talk about the weapons testing period, so the period in the late 1950s and early 1960s when the US and the Soviet Union were carrying out extensive atmospheric testing of nuclear bombs. And this spread radioactive cesium and radioactive strontium throughout the world. And of course I'll tell you about the Chernobyl accident and a little bit about what we think we learned from Fukushima. And I should say that over the years I've collaborated with many scientists in Western Europe and also in Ukraine, Belarus and Russia. I won't list them, but many of the results that I present today are based on collaborations with a wide range of scientists. I started my undergraduate studies as an astrophysicist. So I worked at, this is the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh in Scotland, and I studied astrophysics there. And when I finished my undergraduate degree, I decided that astrophysics was too difficult, and I was more interested in doing some applied research in the environment. So I transferred and I did a PhD study on the Chernobyl accident, because in the UK we received a little bit of radiocesium from Chernobyl, and I was studying, as I'll explain, radioactive cesium in lakes and rivers in the English Lake District. And I carried on those studies and finally wrote a book about, or edited a book about Chernobyl. I don't suggest you buy this book because it's very expensive and the publishers don't give me any money. But I put a PDF of the book on ResearchGate, so if you want to see the book, you download the PDF for free. I think it's interesting to think. I'm a modeler, so I try to model the fate of radionuclides in the environment. And for me, it's interesting to think about how models in physics compare with models in the environmental sciences. And this is a model of the solar system. So it's called an orrery. And in the years after Newton's great discoveries about how the solar system functions, a very rich Englishman called the Earl of Orrery said, I want somebody to build me a model of the solar system. And so we call this an orrery, and a very clever clockmaker built this system. And you can buy these systems now, and it uses clockwork to simulate the motions of the planets and the moons around the sun in the solar system, using Newton's laws of gravitation. And this is a physical description of mathematical equations. So this is a real, we talk about mathematical models. Well, this is a real physical model of how a series of mathematical equations can predict reality. And of course, Newton's equations, with some corrections, Newton's equations can perfectly predict the motions of the planets and the moon within the solar system. And this is what we try to do in environmental science. We try to build models which will predict, thank you. We try to build models which will predict the fate, the movement of radioactivity within systems. But over the years, I've thought a lot about what's different about physical models and environmental models. And the interesting thing is that although this model is mathematically quite complicated, the system it's attempting to model is very simple. So in physics, we know the masses of all the planets. We can observe in a very detailed way their motions around the sun. And the solar system as a physical system is very regular. So the planets follow very regular patterns. And for example, the Earth doesn't change over millions of years its velocity of motion around the sun. And I will contrast this with ecosystems, environmental systems, which are actually much more complex than this solar system. And this, to me, I thought that astrophysics was too difficult. Well, actually, environmental science and ecosystems are much, much more complicated than many physical systems. And this is what we worked on. This is what we tried to study, was the fate of radioactive cesium in the environment of Europe after the Chernobyl accident. And of course there were many radionuclides emitted from the Chernobyl accident, but in the long term it was radiocesium that causes the primary dose. So it's the most important long-term contaminant from Chernobyl. So this shows a map of the Ukraine, Belarus and Russia, and the level of radioactive cesium emitted from Chernobyl. And we can see the area around the 30-kilometre zone, we call it, the area around Chernobyl, which is currently evacuated, with very high levels of radioactive cesium. So that the accident was characterized by, within the near zone, very high fuel particle fallout, and further away fallout of more volatile radionuclides such as radioactive cesium. And we can see here the 30-kilometre zone contamination, and we see contamination here on the border between Belarus and Russia. And this was due to the fire at Chernobyl continued for 10 days, and different amounts of radioactivity were emitted at different times after the accident. And it happened that when a cloud of radioactive gas was emitted, it rained on this part of Belarus and Russia and washed out the radioactivity. And that's why we see even 150 kilometers away from the plant, we see some very high levels. This is up to 1.5 megabecquerels per square meter. So we see contamination. And when I began working at Chernobyl, many of these areas were under radiation control. And still some areas, some of these small patches here, they are still evacuated. So radioactivity from Chernobyl spread around Europe, and there was contamination in parts of northern Italy, in southern Germany, Austria, but perhaps more importantly, a plume of radioactive contamination spread across Scandinavia, and again rainfall washed out radionuclides onto the terrestrial ecosystem. And in the UK we had quite a small amount of radioactivity, only in some parts in the north of Wales, and this is in the UK this is the rainy part. So the weather comes from the Atlantic, and it rains a lot in the west of the UK. And where it happened to rain, in North Wales, in the uplands of the Lake District, Cumbria, and in parts of Scotland, there was fallout of radioactive contamination. So the Chernobyl accident was very widespread, affecting quite significant parts of Europe, and it was also long-lasting. And there's still issues in parts of Scandinavia with contamination of reindeer meat from the Chernobyl accident. So it's important in this map, this is very large areas of land are contaminated with different ecosystems, different soil types, different agricultural practices, and so this as a problem, this is a very complicated problem. It's a very complex problem. It's not like the solar system, which is also very complex, but it's regular and predictable. The environment is irregular, variable, changeable with season, with temperature, with weather. As a physical problem, it's very difficult. So my job as a PhD student, and then subsequently, was to study and mathematically model the radioactive pollution of lakes after Chernobyl, and we see some contrasting systems. This is the cooling pond at Chernobyl, 22 square kilometre reservoir which held the cooling water for the reactor. We see a lake in the UK, in the Lake District in the UK, a small lake, and this part of the UK, we call these soils boggy soils. It means they're very wet, and I don't think in Japan there are so many of these types of soils, but the soil around here, the soil is more or less all organic. So there's very, very low mineral content and very high water content. So if you put your foot on them, they make a squelching noise and you get a wet foot. So they're really very organic. And I'll talk about this later. These organic soils, these boggy soils, are ones where we saw very high cesium runoff in the dissolved phase, because the cesium remained in available forms. And these are a couple of lakes in Belarus. This is Vitoria Lake, which I'll show you later. So we have a wide range of different aquatic ecosystems were contaminated. And these ecosystems are complex. These are examples of food webs, of which animals eat which other animals in different ecosystems. And we can see this is a temperate food web. So we see the phytoplankton taking up the nutrients, the zooplankton eating the phytoplankton, the small fish eating the zooplankton, and so on, and a lot of connections. And food webs can become very complicated, and you can see this is in Venezuela. It's not like the UK. It's a swamp, a jungle food web, and the system is enormously complicated. And the challenge is to try and model and predict this enormously complicated ecosystem. And we had in the 1990s in Europe, there was a lot of money available to study the Chernobyl accident because it was a big issue for Europeans. And we were lucky enough to get money from the European Commission to study aquatic ecosystems. And the European Commission, for that time, they had quite an intelligent idea of how to approach this problem. They don't always have intelligent ideas, but this time they did, and they tried to put together groups of different expertise. So they made, for our aquatic group, they made groups with mathematical modelers like me, biologists studying food webs in aquatic systems, geochemists like my colleague Rob Comans, who's done a lot of work on cesium absorption to minerals, biologists even studying the very detailed molecular pathways of radiocesium, of how it gets into fish. And this was a good idea because it brings the modelers and the experimentalists together, and hopefully we learn from each other. And our approach, which at the time seemed a good approach, and in a scientific point of view it was a good approach, was to try and construct a model to simulate how this ecosystem works. So to try and this is a very clever model by a colleague of mine, Lars Håkansson, in Uppsala University in Sweden, and using the knowledge of the biologists, the chemists, the geologists, to try and construct a model which would simulate, which would try and reproduce all the different pathways of radiocesium in an aquatic ecosystem. And this is I only show you this not to make you understand all these different connections, but to show you just how complicated this model is. It's hugely complicated. It's got different pathways for transfers from sediments into water, from water into phytoplankton, into zooplankton, into different components of the aquatic ecosystem. It's hugely complicated. I'll show you my bit of this model, which I developed while I was doing my PhD, was to study in great detail the interaction of radioactive cesium with lake sediments. And so, again, don't look at the equation, but the point I want to make is that this is a very complicated system. So we have burial of the sediment as new layers of sediment are created. We have radioactive cesium diffusion within the aqueous part of the system, and we have absorption of radioactive cesium to available, so more easily exchangeable phases, and with less easily exchangeable phases, what we call fixed radioactive cesium. And myself and my colleague Rob Comans in the Netherlands, we spent a lot of time on this model, and we worked very hard on it, and we did experiments, and we took sediment cores and in detail looked at the profile of how the radiocesium moves within the different phases. And I think it was a nice model for a scientific model. But the problem with this model is that there are so many individual parameters. Yes, it can make predictions for one system where you know very well what the ammonium content is, what the potassium content, what the proportion of different clay mineral types is, what the water content of the sediment is, all these various different parameters. The problem is that there were very, very many lakes contaminated by the Chernobyl accident, and they all have different sediment composition, different water currents, different temperatures, different radioactive cesium availability, and so it made it very difficult to use this model in different systems, because you have to measure so many things about the system in order to make the model work. This is the fish submodel, and it has different components of the transfer of radioactive cesium into fish, even to the extent of looking at the molecular pathways which we know are important for the transfer of radioactive cesium and potassium, its analogue, into the fish body. And again, I think it's a very nice model. It's a very nice scientific simulation of how this system works, but it's very difficult to use because of the number of parameters it needs. This model made a good prediction, and this is the kinetic model for the transfer of radioactive cesium into fish as it changes with the concentration of potassium. So we know that if you look on the periodic table, radioactive cesium and potassium are on the same line. Is it that my chemistry is not very good? Is it the alkaline earths? I can't remember. Any chemists? Anyway, they're in the first line.
Alkaline metals?
Alkaline metals, thank you, yes. They're in the first line, so they're with cesium, potassium, sodium. There's another one, but that's not important. So they're on the same line in the periodic table. And this means that their aqueous chemistry is quite similar. And the size of the cesium ion is very similar in water. The hydrated radius is very similar to potassium. And so fish don't need cesium. Organisms don't need cesium. It's not a part of our biology, but they need potassium. So almost all tissue in the body has potassium. And so fish bioaccumulate potassium because they need it through the food chain, slightly through the gills, but mainly through the food chain. They absorb potassium in their bodies. And it turns out that it's difficult for the fish cell to distinguish, to tell the difference between cesium and potassium. So because the fish are bioaccumulating potassium, they also bioaccumulate radioactive cesium. And the accumulation factors can be quite high, particularly in systems where the potassium is scarce, where there's not much potassium. So we can see this is the bioaccumulation of radioactive cesium in low potassium systems and also in high potassium systems. And we can see a very big difference in the bioconcentration of radioactive cesium depending on the potassium content of the water. So this is a good result, and it was developed using some very nice laboratory experiments where fish are fed with radioactive cesium with different levels of potassium accompanying it. And it helped us understand a lot. It was important because it helped us understand about the mechanisms of radioactive cesium absorption in organisms. But the problem was that this model was developed using laboratory fish. And laboratory fish are not like fish in the real environment. Usually they're quite small because it's easier to keep them in a tank and they're fed at particular conditions. And so we needed to calibrate this model, and we modelers, we like to calibrate our models because it gives us the right results. So we had to calibrate this model for real systems in the environment. And how did we do that? We looked at some data from the nuclear weapons testing period. So this is an important study of measurements from the nuclear weapons testing period of bioaccumulation, the bioaccumulation factor of radioactive cesium. So that's the concentration of cesium in the fish divided by the concentration in the water. So this is the bioaccumulation factor of cesium in lots of different systems of lakes and rivers compared to the potassium concentration in the water. And we can see two important features from this. The first is that in systems of very low potassium concentration in the water, the bioaccumulation of cesium is very high. So this is a factor of about 3,000 or 4,000. So the concentration of cesium in the fish per kilogram of fish is 3,000 or 4,000 times higher than the concentration in becquerels per litre of water. So very high bioaccumulation. And even in piscivorous, so that means fish which eat other fish, so predatory fish, and even up to 10,000 or even 20,000 times in low potassium systems. In high potassium systems, and this is true of seawater, so seawater has potassium very well higher up here, but the accumulation factor in seawater is around 80. So in seawater, because the potassium is abundant, the accumulation factor of cesium is very low. So this is an important graph. So it gives us this inverse relation between the radioactive cesium in the fish and the potassium concentration of the system. And it's something that's seen, it's more complicated in terrestrial systems, but it's also a feature of cesium accumulation in terrestrial systems where nutrients, where potassium is abundant, the cesium accumulation is lower. Another important thing is that the bioaccumulation increases as you go up the aquatic food chain. So we call the level of a fish the trophic level. So a plankton is at a very low trophic level. A herbivorous, non-predatory fish is at a higher trophic level. A predatory fish, like, I don't know, do you have pike in Japan? Fish that eat other fish at the highest trophic level. So the fish at the highest trophic level accumulate what we call it biomagnification. So they accumulate more radioactive cesium than fish at a lower. So these open circles are fish at a lower trophic level. So the peaceful fish, the fish that don't eat other fish, compared to the predatory fish. So this is the first lesson I learned, was that it's important to look at the old literature, because radiation and radioactive cesium and strontium and iodine were very intensively studied during the 1950s and 1960s. And actually, as I'll show, in Japan, some of the monitoring of the weapons test fallout was the best in the world. There was a very extensive data of monitoring the fallout from the atmospheric nuclear weapons testing in Japan, and throughout the world monitoring was conducted, and many studies were conducted, and actually some of the things that we thought we learned from the Chernobyl accident were things that we'd actually rediscovered that scientists had learned in the 1950s or 1960s, 1970s, that scientists had known many years before. But we rediscovered them after the Chernobyl accident. So my first lesson that I learned was that to look at the old literature and the empirical data from the nuclear weapons test period, and now the Chernobyl accident is old, and much of the literature is from the 1990s. Some of these literature are very important, and they give us a real guide to how radioactive cesium will behave in the environment. A second lesson, and this is an example of the model that our group came up with, the simulation model. And this model was really useful because it helped us understand the interactions in the ecosystem, but I don't believe that it was very useful in making predictions for new systems, because this is just the fish submodel part of this model. So imagine the other parts with the movement of radioactive cesium in sediments, in water. The other parts were just as complicated as this fish model. In order to move this model from one system where we'd calibrated it, where we'd measured all these different things, to move this model from one lake to another, or one river to another, is almost impossible, because you have to do a full 3-year scientific research program to find all the parameters which you need to calibrate and use this model. And so subsequent to this, so after this, we developed another model which tried to use more simple relationships, to try and have a model which firstly you could transfer from one system to the other, because there are many rivers and many lakes, and then to simplify the model so it really has only those parameters which really make a big difference. And that's not to say that there aren't other parameters which make a difference, but we can't use them because they're too variable and they need too much effort to calibrate. And so we tried to simplify the model to have a model which we could use firstly in many different systems, and secondly, if there's a nuclear accident, we don't have all these parameters. We don't know very much about the lakes that we're trying to model or the rivers that we're trying to model. So if we want a model which we can use to make predictions in the event of a nuclear accident, it has to be very simple. So we simplified this model, and the model that we finished with looked like this. So much more simple, and as a physicist, I find this much easier to use. So it has transfers, and of course these are the transfer parameters. Within these parameters there are many processes, and so this greatly simplifies the system. it also makes it, you also risk missing important processes because these parameters lump many processes together. But this is unavoidable, and later when I show you some of the tests of this model, you'll see that we have wide error bars. So it means that we don't believe we can predict the cesium exactly, but we think that we can predict it as best we can with the available information that we have, and this is our objective. And also it's interesting that in the environment there are many different competing processes, and sometimes, but not always, these many different competing processes lead to general patterns which make systems behave in similar ways, and I think I want to try and show you an example of that later on. So this model is not a perfect model because it's very simple, but it allows us to make useful predictions. So the next thing that I learned was that sometimes, not always, but sometimes simple models can make better predictions than complicated ones. And if you look at the uncertainty of the parameters in very complex models, and you put all those uncertainties in, we use a technique called Monte Carlo modeling, and sometimes the cesium transfer to fish is an example of this. If we would put in a complex model, if we put all the uncertainties in all the different model parameters and try to estimate the overall uncertainty, we get a huge estimate of uncertainty in the model, because each of our many parameters has its own inherent uncertainty. And in fact, luckily, in the environment, it seems that the uncertainty is not as great as this. And this means that simple models that we use seem to work more or less quite well. And actually, what's interesting is that this has a basis in the philosophy of how science works, because as modelers, very often we don't like to really test our models. So we develop a beautiful model that simulates a system very well, and because we've calibrated this model for that system, we can perfectly predict everything about that, not predict, we can perfectly simulate everything about that system. But we're very reluctant to test the model for a system which the model hasn't seen before. So to really do what's called a blind prediction of how this system will behave. And we're reluctant because very often it doesn't work. And it makes it hard for us to write a paper and get it published if we say we've calibrated this model for our very well studied system, but actually it doesn't work on this system. It would be very difficult to get that paper published, so usually we don't test it. So we say, look at our lovely model, here it is, and we put it in our paper and we get our paper published. The challenge, and we don't like doing it, but the challenge for we modelers is to try and make predictions for systems that we haven't seen before, that our model hasn't seen before. And if you're interested, there's a philosophical basis for how science proceeds. And science proceeds, we very often don't think about it, but science proceeds by getting things wrong. And we don't like to talk about this as scientists because we don't like to say we get things wrong. But actually the way we learn is to try and do something and get it wrong and say, okay, we got it wrong, let's learn from that and improve our model. And you can read about that if you want in this article I wrote about how the philosophy of science applies to environmental systems. So, very often, simple models work better than complex ones. And actually, Einstein said the same thing. And he said, models should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. So that's a very nice way to think about it. The difficult question is, how simple should they be? And have you got all the things that you need in your model that make it work? And this is an example. So I said that our fish model was very simple, but we had to make it a little bit more complicated, because in fish, so this is the radioactive cesium concentration in fish in the Kiev reservoir in the Ukraine after Chernobyl. And this is some work by my colleagues in Ukraine, which shows for non-predatory fish, so roach is a small fish that is peaceful, so it eats phytoplankton, so it's non-predatory. As the size of the fish increases, there's not much difference in the cesium concentration of the fish. But for perch, which is a predatory fish, we see quite a significant increase in the radioactive cesium concentration as the size of the fish increases. And this is due to age of fish, and it's actually quite a complicated process, but we had to include in our model a process which accounts for this increasing radioactive contamination, increasing bioaccumulation of radioactive cesium as the fish get bigger. So we were trying to develop a model for European lakes and rivers, and there are more than 500,000 lakes in Europe, and there are even more rivers and streams. So for accident planning, so post-accident emergency response, we have to have models that are really robust, ones that are reliable and will work, and ones that are based on a minimum of parameters. And even we know that the potassium content of a lake is really important for the radioactive cesium accumulation in fish, but even this key parameter would be very difficult to know for all these lakes in Europe. So for modelling for post-accident management, we have to make very, very big simplifying assumptions. And usually we make assumptions which are what we call conservative. So we try to overestimate in order to make style. The reindeer herders in Scandinavia kept eating reindeer meat even though it was above what we might say is a safe limit, because it was such an important part of their cultural life. So that's the easiest thing, is just to stop people eating the fish. Is there another way? Well, there are things you can do to the catchment, so you can try and put in cesium absorbing barriers and so on, but trying to act at the catchment scale is very difficult because it's much larger scale. And we saw that after in the Fukushima area, the large decontamination works in the catchment have increased the turbidity in the water, which creates higher cesium runoff. So it's not easy to work on the catchment scale. We tried to test a countermeasure on the lake scale. So if you remember, I showed you this graph of bioaccumulation factor of cesium in fish related to potassium concentration. We tested this in Belarus and in the UK, and in Europe. So the dark dots are lakes in Western Europe after Chernobyl. So this is the accumulation factor of cesium in fish and the potassium concentration in the system. So the dark spots are lakes in the UK, the squares are lakes in Belarus. And again we see this inverse relationship. This circle is a particular lake in Scandinavia which is very acid, and we think that also has an impact on cesium uptake. But in general we see this inverse relation between the cesium in the fish and the potassium in the water. So our question was, can we use this to reduce cesium-137 in the fish? And so we did, in theory, a very simple, but in practice a very difficult experiment, which was to put potassium chloride on the lake surface. So my Belarusian colleagues worked really hard. So this is Anatoly Kadelsky and his colleagues at the Geology Institute in Minsk. And we had an EU project to test this countermeasure, and they spread 15 tons of potassium fertilizer on the frozen lake surface. So this is in winter, where the ice cover is thick, and this was a really difficult job. Initially they planned to use a tractor to take the potassium onto the lake, but the tractor driver decided he didn't like the look of it. And we've got to remember that putting salt on ice makes it melt, and so it was a little bit of a dangerous job, I think. But the ice cover was so thick that it was okay. But they used a horse in the end, and the horse didn't really want to go on the lake either, but they did it, and they spread all this potassium fertilizer on the lake and increased the potassium content of the lake water from 1 milligram per litre to 10 milligrams per litre. So a very big increase in the potassium content. And this is what happened, was that the potassium dissolved into the melting ice in spring and increased the potassium in the lake water. And it worked. It worked quite well, actually. So this is the cesium concentration in large perch. So this is how we modelled it. So this is what we would. So this is the initial cesium concentration, around 100,000 becquerels per kilogram. And this is what we would expect from the natural attenuation from this slow fixation of cesium, this slow decline in cesium, without any countermeasures. This is what we predicted with countermeasures, so somewhere in between these two. So what happens is that the potassium initially increases in the lake water, and then it gradually declines as the potassium is absorbed in the sediments and so on. And this increase in potassium in the water reduced the cesium concentration in the fish by about a factor of 3. And actually it worked better than we modelled it, so we saw a decline over time in the potassium in the perch. So the countermeasure worked. Was it useful? Probably not, for two reasons. One is that this is still a high, in terms of where we set the safe limit for cesium, 20,000 is still high. So we reduce from very high to high. Still nobody could eat the fish, although people did, as I'll explain later. The second problem was, and it was one that we expected, so this is the cesium in the water, so it was about 5 becquerels per litre before this is when we did the countermeasure. The potassium was very low, which was why the cesium accumulation in the fish was so high. And this is what we predicted would happen, and it did, was that yes, we increased the potassium content, but because of that, and because of the relation between the potassium in the water and the cesium in the sediment, because of that we remobilized cesium from the sediment, and so it increased the cesium in the water. Now, because of it's a bit detailed, but because of the chemistry of potassium and ammonium and cesium absorption, the overall effect was to reduce the cesium in the fish, but we still increased the cesium in the water. And in a way that's okay, unless you're going to use the water to drink, in which case it's not a good thing. But overall, would I say it worked? Yes, it worked, but was it useful? Probably not. After a lot of effort, I have to say that, and it's difficult to say that, but I think that's probably true. In a theory, you can do this for strontium if you have contamination because strontium and calcium are also analogues, and the same principle can work for strontium, but it's unlikely to be really very useful. So disadvantages of chemical additions are they can be expensive, they can influence the ecology of the water body by adding fertilizer to the lake. There are problems maintaining the high potassium or calcium levels, so in an open lake you have to keep putting potassium in to maintain that content, and it can also increase the radioactivity in the water, so it's not something I would necessarily recommend. Other things you can do: food preparation measures can be effective. So for strontium contamination, if you only eat, because strontium is absorbed in the bone and the skin, if you only eat the muscle, you reduce the dose. It's been shown that salting fish, so adding salt and curing fish with salt, it can significantly reduce the cesium concentrations, but it affects the taste and the nutritional value, and it's unlikely to be publicly acceptable. Very often food measures, at least in Western Europe, people don't like it. An example is after a fallout with radioactive iodine, you can make, so usually milk is condensed, so milk you can't drink because the iodine content in the milk is high enough. You can make cheese from that milk and keep the cheese for 6 months. We like old cheese, especially in France. People like old, at least in Western Europe, they like old cheese. So you keep it, and then the iodine's gone. It's gone by physical decay. And we can't be sure about that than about anything. You know, this is something that we absolutely know. But trying to convince the public of that is very difficult. And we all have a kind of thing, we don't like contaminated food, and this is why the food is such an issue, because it's not just a scientific problem, it's how we conceive of food, and and I understand it, having spent all this time studying radioactivity. We still don't like to feel that our food's contaminated, and so I'm not sure that these kind of measures are acceptable. The other point is that if you salt fish, for example, I think the salt is more damaging to health than cesium, at least at these kind of relatively low concentrations, and it's a little bit controversial to say that, but I would rather eat fish that's contaminated with cesium than fish that's really high in salt, because I have high blood pressure and it's bad for me. And this is a really interesting thing about how we conceive of risk of radiation. We always think about the radiation risk, but we tend not to think about all the other risks that we face in our lives. So fish farms, farmed fish is usually clean because most of the cesium goes through the food ingestion pathway, and if you feed the fish with clean food, it works. I'll just briefly talk about irrigation water, because there was a little bit of work done in Chernobyl after irrigation, for irrigation, because the Pripyat-Dnieper river reservoir system provides irrigation water for a large part of Ukraine. And we know that for land that's already contaminated, because the activity concentrations in water are quite low, then in general, if the land is already contaminated, the irrigation with contaminated water doesn't really make a big difference. But if you have, if you take irrigation water where the river has flowed through a contaminated area, or it originates in a contaminated area, then it can increase the cesium in crops. And this is an example from some Ukrainian scientists who studied irrigated rice in the Dnieper Basin, and this is the strontium concentration, and it shows an increase in rice because this area wasn't contaminated by atmospheric fallout, but the river transferred the contamination down into the irrigation water. It's actually quite low activities though, it's less than a becquerel per kilogram, so it's quite low, but irrigation of course can be an issue. Surface irrigation, particularly for cesium, surface irrigation is less affected than spray irrigation, because in the UK we have a lot of spray irrigation where they spray on top of the crop. If surface irrigation where you irrigate the soil is less affected by contamination than spray, because the soil rapidly absorbs the cesium, whereas the spray irrigation you can get absorption through foliar uptake through the leaves. So there are many disadvantages of countermeasures. So they can be very expensive, and this is true particularly of aquatic systems where the dose is quite low. So if you calculate the cost per person sievert, so the number of potential future cancers averted, that you can calculate a kind of limit to how much you should spend. And this is a bit controversial, but if we have a limited budget on countermeasures, we have to decide where it's most effective to spend the money to reduce the dose the maximum way, and this is one way of doing it. Another disadvantage is the dose to the cleanup workers and generation of, we all know that, and some potential unintended consequences. So I mentioned the salting fish can cause problems of excessive salt intake, and there's also potential ecosystem damage from large-scale measures. So removing litter layers from forests can affect the forest ecology. Removing land can affect the ecology of a catchment. So another lesson, we always have to remember that if we do nothing, cesium will decrease in the environment, and we always have to weigh our countermeasure against the knowledge that over time there is natural attenuation of cesium, and sometimes we have to, if we're doing countermeasures, we have to decide, is this worth doing, given that we know that cesium will decline in the environment over time. Okay, I'll talk briefly about effects on aquatic organisms, radiation effects on the ecosystem, because maybe not in Japan, but in Western Europe and the US, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about because radiation protection has always traditionally focused mainly on people, on reducing the dose to people. But now in Western Europe and in the US, there's a lot of discussion, does radiation affect the ecosystem itself? And initially after Chernobyl, this wasn't a big issue. There were some studies, but yes, we know that in certain areas there was damage to the ecosystem in the short term, but in the long term people were more concerned about the dose to humans. But now we're interested in studying, is the ecosystem damaged by radiation? We know in Chernobyl that there was such high doses and hot particle contamination that some small areas had very serious ecosystem impacts. We can see this is reactor number 4 at Chernobyl that exploded, and just next to it is an area of forest that the Ukrainians called the Red Forest, and it was called the Red Forest because after the accident the doses were so intense, up to 20 gray per day to trees. The doses were so intense that forests died. So and the leaves turned brown. This was spring. The leaves turned brown because the trees were killed, and they called it, well, it was a kind of reddy brown. They called it the Red Forest because of the colour of the trees. And you can see on on pictures of this area after the accident, you can see a clear area where the doses were very, very high and the trees died. And probably some small mammals died. People weren't really studying them, but there was effects on small mammals and birds in this area as well. Now this area is important, but it's quite small. So it's less than 1% of the total area of the exclusion zone at Chernobyl. Ukrainian scientists studied cattle. Some cattle were left in the zone, and some died from radioactive iodine. So the iodine they ate, deposited on grass. Cattle eat a lot of grass, and the iodine was absorbed in their thyroids, as it is with humans, and that damage to the thyroid killed some cattle. Some that survived were taken by the Ukrainian scientists, and they were bred to look at the second generation, and the report was that the second generation were normal. In the long term, so we know that there were severe effects in these very contaminated areas at Chernobyl in the short term after the accident, where dose rates were very, very high. Now dose rates in the exclusion zone, because of the decay of short-lived nuclides, the dose rates are about 100 times less than they were in those first few weeks. But the question is, are these chronic dose rates? So humans, we can move from an area, we can stop eating contaminated food. Wildlife remain in the Chernobyl area and remained after the accident. And the question is, do these lower chronic dose rates, do they affect the ecosystem? We looked at aquatic systems, and I don't know if you watched the Simpsons cartoon in Japan. Do you watch it? There was an episode of the Simpsons where Bart Simpson, he catches a fish from the cooling pond of his local nuclear power station, and it has 3 eyes. And so our question is, do we find big effects of radiation on the aquatic ecosystem at Chernobyl? We studied many lakes in different parts, so up to Globoki Lake, which is in a real hot spot at Chernobyl. Lakes at different levels of contamination around Chernobyl, and we tried to look at the health of the aquatic ecosystem. So I worked with biologist colleagues, and they study aquatic invertebrates. So they study the populations in lakes in the UK, in rivers in the UK, and they're experts on aquatic invertebrates. So they study the biodiversity and populations of aquatic invertebrates in lakes in Chernobyl, and they study things that normally affect aquatic invertebrate populations, like the lake depth, the pH, the phosphate, and so on. And we also looked at the cesium contamination. And this is one thing that we found. This is a measure of the taxon richness. So it's a measure of the number of different species of aquatic invertebrates. And on this axis is increasing radioactive contamination, right up to Globoki, which is one of the most contaminated lakes in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And what did we find? We didn't find any correlation. So we found that the abundance and diversity of aquatic invertebrates in the lakes at Chernobyl was not related to radiation. These other environmental factors were more important, and in fact it wasn't statistically significant, but Globoki, the most contaminated lake, had the highest abundance and diversity of aquatic invertebrates. So at the population level, contamination doesn't seem to have affected the aquatic ecosystem, and we see this in the lakes. This is the number of fish species we've counted in different lakes, going from low contaminated systems right up to Globoki Lake and the cooling pond, and we don't see a difference. In fact, when the cooling pond was operating, so there was warm cooling water going into the cooling pond, the fish species diversity was very high, because there were a number of species that liked the warm water from the reactor cooling water. It's lower now because the cooling pond's being decommissioned, but it had a diverse community of fish species. And we've studied many fish, including big catfish from the cooling pond, and we don't see any obvious deformities. So we don't see any fish with 3 eyes or the wrong number of fins or anything. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't more subtle effects. So I don't think from the studies that we've done that there are big effects on animal and aquatic organisms. I don't think there are big effects on their populations. So for example, in Belarus, we see a very high, in the exclusion zone, we see very high wolf population, elk, wild boar, roe deer. We see a very high mammal population because the people aren't there. And the things that people do, hunting, forestry, agriculture, just habiting an area, I think damage the ecosystem much more than the radioactive contamination. But it's interesting to see, can we see from these chronic exposures, can we see any more subtle effects of radiation? And this is a really difficult thing to do in the natural environment. So we have a project at the moment which is trying to, it's funded by our Natural Environment Research Council to try and see if we can see some effects at a more subtle level. Now, this is my postdoctoral student, Adelaide, who's doing work at Chernobyl in the lakes, and this is her field workbench, and she's studying a whole lot of different things. She's studying the histology of the liver and the reproductive organs. She's doing various micronucleus assay, which is looking for damaged DNA. She's looking at expression of different genes. A comet assay, which is another measure of damage to DNA. So she's looking in detail at the fish to see if she can see any effects. And I think probably we'll find some effects at this very subtle individual level, but we don't see big effects on the populations. But in the natural environment is so variable that it's very difficult, because there are so many other factors that affect the health of animal populations in the natural environment. And so proving that there's an effect of radiation and seeing that what I think is quite a small effect of radiation, seeing that in comparison with the other things that happen in the natural environment, seeing that is very difficult. So we're also doing lab experiments, so looking at exposing particularly the developmental stages of fish, exposing them to radiation, and trying to look at measures of the health of the fish in the lab as well. And I think it's very important, if we find an apparent effect in the field, can we reproduce it in the lab? Because that makes us really sure that yes, there's a radiation effect. My PhD student's also doing work, this is him in Belarus, doing work on aquatic invertebrates, doing again more sensitive genetic work and looking, for example, at symmetry of aquatic organisms in these ponds of different contamination. So I just want to finish with a discussion of risk perception very briefly, because this is something that I've done quite a lot of work on and that has interested me a lot after Chernobyl. Is when I started working in Belarus and Ukraine in the 1990s. So I first went to Ukraine and Belarus and Chernobyl in 1994, and I have to say that I was a bit scared because all we'd heard about, and I was a scientist and I'd been studying radioactivity in the UK, but I didn't know, I hadn't learned about, so I knew about becquerels per kilogram and I knew about transfers of cesium to fish and modelling and all these things, but I didn't know about radiation risk, and I didn't know about the amazing work that was done in Japan after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I didn't know about the studies of uranium miners, of nuclear workers. I didn't know about all the massive data we have about how radiation affects our health. And so I was a bit scared because I knew I was going to this radioactive place and nobody had told me what the risk was. And so I've been quite interested in radiation risk, and this is something over the years that I've learned quite a lot about what the evidence base is. And I don't have time to talk about it all now, but if I ever come again to Japan, I would be interested to give you a talk on that, because I think it's a really interesting issue. But I just want to end by talking about risk and the perception of risk. And this is a really difficult for radiation risk. Just 3 weeks after the Fukushima accident, I was asked to write an article in Nature about what I thought about what the impacts of Fukushima would be in the long term, and so I wrote about this, and what I said was that the cesium levels were high enough that there would be long-term evacuation and long-term contamination of foodstuffs. And that's not because I'm very clever or anything, it's because I've looked at what happened after the weapons testing, after Chernobyl, and we've learnt about cesium's behaviour in the environment. But I also mentioned the important point about the social and psychological impacts. And this is another thing that scientists learned after the Chernobyl accident. And if we look at the conclusion, this is the UN Chernobyl Forum report. I was involved in the IAEA part of this report. The World Health Organization, they wrote a report about the health impacts of Chernobyl, and their conclusion was that the mental health impact of Chernobyl is the largest public health problem unleashed by the accident to date. And in fact, as early as 1991, the IAEA discussed this problem that was being seen in Belarus, Russia and Ukraine, was that because people didn't trust the authorities and they didn't know about radiation risk, people were much more concerned about their health, and particularly their children's health. They were much more concerned than we radiation scientists would say is reasonable, because we radiation scientists would look at the doses and we would say many parts of the world have high dose rates from natural radioactivity, so there's nothing to worry about. But this concern is completely reasonable and completely understandable, because radiation is something that we naturally fear. We associate radiation with the terrible atomic bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We associate it with the undoubtedly terrible accidents at Chernobyl and Fukushima. We can't see it, we can't smell it, we don't understand it unless you've spent 20 years studying it. And so fear of radiation is very, very understandable. And 10 years ago, before I had a family, I used to say, why are these people so worried about radiation? It's ridiculous. But now I have a family, I understand that we worry, and we worry about our children to an unreasonable level. So if they get a cough, we think they're dying of pneumonia or something. We think we've got some really terrible lung disease. Parents, naturally, we worry more than we should about our children. And I think if I was living around Fukushima, even though I know as a scientist that the radiation risk is very, very low, and the decontamination efforts have really reduced that risk, and the natural attenuation of cesium has reduced that risk, even though I know that, this feeling of something being contaminated is very difficult to get over. And I'm sure that in Japan you know more about this than me, because this is a big issue, and we've seen that after Fukushima. And how you deal with that is much more difficult than the scientific questions. And I became interested in this when I started working in Belarus in particular, because in the 1990s in Belarus, life expectancy in men was less than 60. And that was not due to radiation, that was due to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the economic and health system. It was due to smoking, it was due to poor diet and poverty. And I remember talking to a fisherman, and I said to him, we were studying the fish because they had nearly 10,000 becquerels per kilogram of cesium. And I said to him, really, you shouldn't be eating this fish, because he was catching fish to eat. And he said, you tell me what I should eat. Because in the 1990s in Belarus, Ukraine and Russia, there was real poverty. And this was the most important issue. And yet, in their minds, people felt that the radiation was, for many people felt the radiation was the very serious issue. And actually the radiation doses were quite low, even to the people who were eating the contaminated food. And so we've talked a lot about dose, but dose is not the most important health, I believe. And you can't say this as a scientist, but my personal opinion from all the research I've done is that dose is not the most important health factor. The most important health factor is how people feel about that dose and how they feel empowered, how they feel that they have the ability to understand what it means to them, and also have the ability to control what their dose is. And I think the work that was done in Japan to distribute dosimeters to help people understand the dose, I think that was really great, and it wasn't done after Chernobyl. But even with all this work, it's really difficult to overcome these social and psychological problems. And so this effort in education and communication, and it's very difficult, but it is possible, and it won't work for everybody. Some people will always think that we don't want radiation and we can't live with radiation, even though that you can show that the external dose rate is lower than it is in many parts of the world. Overcoming this problem is very, very difficult. And I like to finish my lecture with a picture of this man who was a fisherman who was living, he refused to leave the contaminated zone in Belarus. And he said, he lived through the Second World War in Belarus, and he survived, and he said, I don't worry about a bit of radiation. I'm tough. I'm a survivor. And he ate the fish from the contaminated lake that we were doing the countermeasure on. Very, very contaminated fish. He ate vegetables from his own garden. He took groundwater from his well. And he lived to, this was in the 1990s, he lived to about 75. And in Belarus, for men, that was a very good age. And you can't talk about individual cases, but there's evidence in Ukraine and Belarus that the people who refused to leave, they had better life outcomes in terms of how they felt about their lives, their health. They had better life outcomes than people who were moved and evacuated to a place that they didn't want to go. But still the problem is, and he was a survivor, so a positive mental outlook is more important than a radiation risk, and that's something that we have to try and overcome, and it's very difficult. But even how you feel about your life has a bigger effect on your health than a few millisieverts of radioactive cesium. But the problem is, of course, that people with families, they don't want to move their families back. And now that I'm a parent, I understand that feeling, is because you feel responsible for your children, and you want to, even if it's irrational, like my wife and I think that our children have got terrible diseases when they've just got a cough. We know it's irrational, but we can't help thinking it. And this issue is something that's very, very difficult, and it was not solved after Chernobyl, really. And I know Japan's done much more to try and mitigate the consequences of Fukushima, but it's obviously a big issue here as well. So, but my final slide is a tribute to this man who was a survivor, and subjectively, I think he made the right decision. Despite not knowing anything about radiation, he made the right decision. Okay, thank you for your attention.